Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. I'm Megan Bosman, Director of Marketing with Protego Labs, and welcome to today's live webcast, Serverless Security Quick Wins. Quick housekeeping, of course, we have the ability to answer some questions. So if you have any questions, go ahead and enter them in the questions section. It should be at the bottom of your screen. We have left time at the end for those questions, so definitely would appreciate your input. We also have a couple of polls where we'll want to gather feedback from our audience, so I hope you can participate in those as well. And at the end, give us a rating and your feedback as well. So we'll go ahead and get started today, and I'd like to turn things over to our presenter. Hillel Solo is CTO and co-founder of Protego Labs, and he will talk to us today about these serverless security quick wins.
Cool, thanks Megan. Thanks everyone for joining us. Hopefully you caught our last webinar, so I won't do too much kind of recapping on what serverless is. I hope everyone has at least a high-level sense of what's going on with serverless and is as excited as we are about this real big shift in how software is developed. Today I actually want to focus a little bit more on something I touched on last time, which is how least privilege plays into the role of security and why it's difficult and why it's important and how we should accomplish it. So just by way of a quick agenda, I'm going to talk about least privilege, spend just a couple minutes defining what it is and how we achieve it, and then talk about the challenges in least privilege, but also talk about the opportunities for least privilege and why that's important in serverless particularly. Go into the risks. It's not a fear webinar, but I do want to talk about the risks of not doing it right and what happens when we screw things up and give you a little bit of a view of that. And then talk about how we solve that and some of the different techniques and tools that that are out there. I'm going to actually highlight a little bit of the stuff that we're doing now in that space as well. Before I continue, Megan mentioned this, but I'm going to push it down your throats. I really liked the questions last time. We did a Q&A section at the end, and you guys submitted some really fantastic questions. So anyone who's got a question on the topic, please queue them up in the question section on the webinar UI, and we will definitely try to answer as many of them as we can at the end. So just a quick overview of who we are and who I am. I'm Hillel Solo. I'm CTO and co-founder of Protego Labs, as Megan mentioned. I've been doing security for about 20 years now. Spent a whole bunch of them in Cisco, in IoT security. Before that, I was at NDS doing security for video and pay TV and hardware and all sorts of other fun things. Lots of security patents. I enjoy creating security solutions and learning new security solutions, and I live in Israel. But a little bit more about Protego. We're almost a year old, focusing on how to solve the security solution problem for serverless applications, recognizing that in serverless, application security is really paramount to how you protect your value in the cloud. We're designing a really, one of its kind, solution for serverless that really leverages some of the differences between serverless and non-serverless in order to present a solution for security. And feel free to check out our website. And if I'm not doing a demo or anything today, I'll maybe show some slides. But if you do want to see a demo of our product or play with it or play with a trial version, please do reach out to us, and we'll happily set you up with that. Okay, so I want to just I'm not going to define serverless, and I could spend a half hour defining serverless. Those who know me know I could just go forever on that. But I do want to talk about what serverless security entails. And just focus on a couple of points. One is it's easier and harder. When I say easier and harder, I mean there are a bunch of things that just get better in terms of security when you move to serverless. I'm not going to harp on the benefits of serverless in general, but when you do move over to serverless, some of the things that get better, for example, are just the very fact that you don't have to patch operating systems and runtimes and deal with any of that. Amazon and Microsoft, those guys are almost definitely going to be better than most of us at doing that. They're going to be faster at it, and we don't have to pay for it once they do it, right? So we don't have to have ops people constantly, reviewing patches and deciding which ones to put in place, and then patching all our containers and redeploying them. That whole problem goes away, and that's great. And there are a bunch of other things I think that get better when you move to serverless. Stateless and ephemeral is an advantage in a lot of ways. There are some things that get harder. Those we talked a little bit about those last time, so I won't go into too much depth, but things like the erosion of the perimeter, the fact that your application doesn't really have a really clear boundary and entrance where you can, sort of pile on your WAF, security and hope for the best. Serverless applications are more fine-grained and they're event-driven, and you have to ask yourself about each function, who could trigger that function, who can manipulate the input to that function, what could happen. So those, that definitely changes the way that you think about security when you move to serverless. There are other things we'll talk about in terms of least privilege that are also different or harder. And again, there are also some opportunities that don't exist that didn't exist as well previously. One of the things that's really important is the holistic approach. I know that sounds like a cliche, but it's really important not to fall into the rabbit hole of thinking just about securing your functions. Functions are a big part of serverless. They're not the only part of serverless. Functions are a really important place to put security because they're compute, and wherever there's compute, you can have security compute, which is great. And part of our own solution is certainly ingesting and pushing security features into functions as part of the solution. But it's really critical that you take a very holistic approach to security. You're looking at the entire application and its context. You're looking at the entire life cycle, not just runtime. Because a lot of the wins come, during CI/CD, during deployment, during operations, not necessarily just during defense. And one of the really key pieces of that, which I want to focus on today, certainly not the only piece, but a key piece, is least privilege. And I want to just sort of highlight why that's really important here. So if you just kind of think about the best practices, people will tend to, and I've just boiled this down to something really simplistic and silly. So don't beat me up too much on this slide. But if you think about the shift from a traditional system to serverless in the way that you have ceded, for better and for worse, control over most of the stack, except for configuration and application, to the cloud provider. Again, a lot of good in that, and a lot of challenges in that. You now own configuration and application, and if you're going to get security, that's where you're going to get it from. So things like OS hardening and admin rights and SSH, and segmentation, those things tend to kind of disappear on you, for better and for worse. You don't own them. They don't necessarily even exist. They're not yours to secure, and they may not even be there to help you. Some of them aren't relevant. You're not worried about someone who has SSH access to your Lambda function. On the other hand, what are you focusing on? You're focusing on making sure that your security is tightly wrapped around your application and applied correctly. And one of your big friends there is IAM roles. The ability to provision security around each resource, functions and S3 buckets and Azure functions and databases and so on and so forth. Those things, those IAM roles are really critical in ensuring that you guys are as secure as possible. So let's just talk about what least privilege is. There's a bunch of definitions. I like this one, but very fundamentally, it's the notion that each piece of your application, each function in the application, each part of the application should execute with the minimum privileges available, necessary to it. This presupposes, and it's worth pointing out, it presupposes there's a concept of privilege. It presupposes that there is something that enforces a differentiation of privilege between different entities in the system. Not every system has that, right? So the notion of least privilege starts with, okay, there's some way to provision privileges to each part of the application in a way that limits what they can do. Assuming that kind of infrastructure exists, least privilege says, let's ensure that we've applied the smallest set of permissions to each part of the application so that it can function correctly, but at the same time it can do nothing else, right? And so this is clearly a critical piece of security and a critical piece of achieving the smallest possible attack surface you can in deploying an application, and yet it really is very rarely achieved. It's one of those, it's the unicorn of security configuration. Okay, so before I dive into why it's the unicorn and why it's difficult, just to illustrate one example of what I mean by this, here's 4 lines of code I stole from some function somewhere. This code is, let's see, looks like JavaScript code. It's going to connect to S3, and it's going to access a file stored in an S3 bucket, and it's going to write that file to a local file and file system. Now, if you're a quick and dirty, get it done developer, you're probably going to write something like this, okay? I'm allowing all actions on S3 to all buckets on S3, okay? And that is great because it gets the job done. Code will run, the code will not fail, the code will not give me errors because it lacks permission. Of course, the challenge is this code can actually access all the buckets, not just my bucket, and it can all the buckets in my account, obviously, and it can access. It can not just read from those buckets. It can delete files. It can create files. It can delete buckets themselves. It has a lot of permissions. A slightly better version of this that you might find if someone's a little more security conscious is where I'm going to lock this down to a particular bucket. So I can still do any action. I still wildcard the actions, but I have actually specified the bucket that I can access, and so that's a little bit better. So I care about security, but a least privileged version of this might look something like this. We can argue about whether we should tighten it even further, but something that says you can actually just do get object. You can only retrieve files from the bucket and only for this particular bucket. And you can see how achieving least privilege here really helps shrink what a potential attacker who somehow achieved an injection attack, for example, on your code could do. An injection attack into this area of the code could only, in the last case, read files from this particular bucket. Can't read files from any other bucket, can't write files to this bucket, can't delete the bucket, etc. And so that will immediately shrink significantly what an attacker can do. Now let's talk a little bit about some of the challenges in least privilege. Why is least privilege the unicorn? Why isn't it one of those things that just pops up into our system automatically? As I do that, I'm going to implore you again to ask me questions. I'm happy to see a few at the end. We have a couple coming in, but I'd like to see more. So as you come up with, as I say something that you disagree with, challenge me on it. As I say something unclear, ask me about it. So some of the things that pop up in anyone's life cycle doing application development that get in the way of least privilege, and I like to harp on this a little bit. Security is kind of the opposite of development in a way. This one is probably going to get me in trouble with some of you out there, but security is kind of the process of limiting. Development is the process of creating, of enabling. So as a developer, I'm taking a blank file and I'm adding functionality to it. I'm trying to enable things that couldn't happen in the past to happen. And that's, it's a miracle. It's the miracle of birth, right? But at the same time, security is the process of saying, wait, actually, I don't want all of those things to happen. I want to limit what can happen. And it's really, really challenging and really ineffective in a lot of cases to ask the same people to do that job at the same time. And so this is sort of saying, even if all the other problems below aren't problems, which we'll talk about in a second, just fundamentally asking the developer, hey, as you're writing your code or each time you deploy it, take a look and see what don't you need and carve away the things you don't need. That's difficult. It's a difficult thing to ask, whereas the developer's instinct is, let me just enable. Anything that's in my way, let me turn it off, let me enable. The other thing is it takes time. So even if you really are inclined to do it well, it takes a significant amount of time to get it right. We've looked at this a little bit. You could spend, developers will sometimes spend 1, 2, maybe 3 minutes even looking at roles every time they deploy, and we're seeing that's certainly not enough. You could spend 5, 6 minutes each time looking at each time you deploy a function. What did I change? How did that affect roles? Did I take anything away that I don't need? That's very time consuming. Security also gets in the way. Security is something that blocks functionality, and for developers, that's frustrating, right? And we've seen organizations where developers have said, no, we're not willing to work in a situation where security has all these gates in the way of our functionality. We want to control those gates. There's also lack of visibility very often. You can use libraries where you don't even know which permissions you need. Sometimes there's lack of granularity where the IAM or the permission system that you have doesn't have the granularity to enforce the policies that you want. So you actually know I only need to do X, but there isn't a rule that says just X. There's a bunch of things together, and it's either all or nothing. So that can be challenging. And finally, and this is maybe the most important thing, is there's a lack of awareness. And let's be honest, all of us suffer from this to some degree, but there's a lack of awareness of how important this is for ensuring that our application doesn't just work when everything's okay, but doesn't fall over when people try to make it fail. So a quick poll before we continue. Let's see how I turn polls on, right? There we go. I'm going to click on that button. Start voting. All right. So I want a quick poll on people who are out there. Who owns the IAM roles in your organization? So if you're deploying functions in the cloud or containers in the cloud, who's controlling those IAM roles and permissions and policies? Is it the security people? Is it the DevOps people? Are there DevOps people in your organization still? Is it developers working directly and controlling those directly? Or do you have no idea what I'm talking about? So go ahead and click on one of those options, and let's see how that plays out. And I'm going to continue. So I want to dig in a little bit further into why these challenges get worse in serverless, or why is it harder in serverless? And there are a couple points I want to make. One is just the increasing number of resources. We've seen organizations that have really transitioned wholeheartedly from non-serverless to serverless and really gone all in, and they've gone from 20 or 30 active containers into maybe 1,000 functions or 800 functions or 1,200 functions. So they've really divided their applications to smaller units. And the process of provisioning each of those units with permissions is really, really time-consuming and challenging. But when it went from 20 to 1,000, or sometimes more, you're now in a situation where that problem is much harder and much more difficult to track. And the other thing is you now have an increase in velocity, right? People move to serverless for many reasons, but one big one is they want to have more application velocity. They want to be able to deploy features quicker, fix bugs faster. And part of the reason they can do that is because developers are empowered to make small changes and deploy those changes quickly and not have to wrap up an entire container or VM. But that also means that you're deploying code more frequently, more rapidly, small changes more often rather than big changes once in a while. And so that increases further the challenge of, am I really going to spend time crafting and thinking about these roles all the time? There's also a greater interdependence between resources. So as you imagine, a lot of these little functions and buckets and tables being wired together, you can sort of envision how permissions can sometimes apply to more than one thing. You can have roles that are shared by functions, so if one person changes a role and now it affects other functions that have it. Functions might have previously been inaccessible to the outside world, and now they are accessible to the outside world. So that kind of change in a small part of the application, which can cascade into other areas, makes it more challenging still to keep those permissions at least privileged. So I see votes coming in. I like that. I want more votes. So if you haven't voted, go ahead and vote. Even the I am what option is a possibility, and at least one of you has answered that. The other thing I want to focus in on, though, is not just the challenges, because everyone likes to talk about how hard things are, but the opportunities. And really the point here is that when you move into a serverless environment, there's an opportunity for much more fine-grained least privilege. So if you just imagine a classic application with those containers, each of those containers, they did a lot of things. That's not to say that you should not be looking at your containers and asking yourself, what kind of permissions I should be giving containers, what policies I want to apply to them. But even when you do that, you'll find that they genuinely need a lot of permissions. They genuinely do a lot of things. And so it's challenging to apply least privilege in a meaningful way to those containers when the least privilege is pretty privileged. And when you move over to a serverless architecture, one of the benefits of carving up your application into these smaller nano services and redeploying them that way as functions is that you can actually now apply a separate IAM role to each function. Not every organization does that, by the way. We recommend it highly. I think it's sort of a trap to say, let me manage a smaller number of roles, but then bucket functions by what they need, because you always end up giving functions more permissions than they need. So if you manage it that way, you can actually achieve least privilege. And I've done the world's dumbest illustration just to show you how that looks. But here you can just imagine these three containers with a bunch of functions inside them, wrapped up as three containers. Each of those containers does a whole bunch of things with a whole bunch of resources. But as we shift that to a serverless architecture, and each of those functions becomes an entity on its own, well, you can see the mess. You can see there's more spaghetti. There's more arrows. On the other hand, you can see that each function kind of has one or two arrows. And I've only pointed at which resources types they're using. If you imagine, which table can they read, can they write, can they change, can they delete, etc. You can imagine that each of these arrows is much narrower. And so if you apply an IAM role, a policy, a permission to each of these functions separately, you actually can significantly shrink the attack surface. Now, let's just think about why that is. On the left side, if there is a vulnerability in any one of these functions, then the attacker can typically exploit all the permissions of the container. So you've got one function that doesn't, sanitize its code really well. It allows an attacker to, inject some code or a process or something. That code or process is running with the role of that container and can do all the things the container can do. Switch over to a function, and let's imagine you have the exact same vulnerability, use the same code, but now it's just that one function. And so now you can only get access to whatever that particular function has as opposed to the entire container. So the win is bigger. So the opportunity for security that, for least privilege to be meaningful and mitigate a tremendous number of potential attacks in your system is much more powerful in a serverless application than it was in a monolithic application or a container-based application, where you, again, should still be doing it, but your mileage may vary there. Of course, at the same time, as we talked about earlier, the challenge of getting it right is really hard. So let's see what that means. What's the risk of all this? So who cares, right? So I grabbed some screenshots out of our platform. Again, this is not a demo. If you want a demo, feel free to reach out. We're showing demos all over the place, but I didn't want to, spend your education time on demoing my product. But I did want to just use some screenshots to show you what I mean by the risk. So what? Big deal. So the function's got extra permissions. So here I've got a function which I typically use for a demo. It's got access to CloudWatch, which is typical, and then it also has access to S3. But if you look on the right side, you can maybe see, I actually can't see because the resolution is terrible, but hopefully you can. You can maybe see that the function has both getObject and putObject rights on the S3 bucket. It only actually needs putObject. So we've done static analysis automatically and decided that we've learned how the function behaves. We know what it needs. It doesn't need getObject, and we want to recommend and help you remove that getObject. Okay, but why? What's the big deal? So this function handily has a second problem, which is it's got a, oh, wait, no. I moved too quickly. I have a second poll. Our second poll. I want to ask you before I continue, what percentage would you guess of your functions, and of course, I haven't analyzed your functions, so I don't really know, but I do know it's typical from what we've seen so far. What percentage of the functions that you've deployed serverlessly would you estimate have additional permissions beyond what they need? Small extra permissions, large extra permissions, but extra permissions. So I'm going to open the poll up and just take a stab at what you think is most common, and then afterwards I'll tell you what we've been seeing so far, which I was surprised by. So in this particular function, I've highlighted a second risk. The system, our system has also spotted a supply chain vulnerability. What that means in our cases, there's a third-party library we've pulled in that has a known vulnerability. Easy to track. We scan what you have in your applications. We look it up on a bunch of databases, and we tell you, hey, you're using a library that's risky. Great. But now the confluence of these two problems is really going to be challenging. Why is that? Because now, as an attacker, I can find the function that I can call. I can trigger it. I can find a way to use this code execution vulnerability that you've left inside to run code. But I can also then leverage the fact that this function has additional permissions it didn't need, in this case, getObject, to rip files out of the database. And when we do a demo, this is typically what I do. I show something like this, where I handily pull up Postman, and I shove some code inside some JSON, and I send it to my function that's exposed to this kind of problem. And happily, the function then at the bottom of the screen spits out some file that I pulled out of S3. Okay, so the point here is now you have two problems, which is not atypical. One of them allowed you to execute code inside the function. The other allowed you to access things in S3 that you didn't need to have access to for that function, right? Now, of course, you might say, but the function might need access to read from S3. Correct. But if you remember the container to function paradigm shift, in the container world, as long as any function in the container needed access to read from S3, then all the functions could do that, and then any hole in any function let you do that. Now, the attacker needs to find a function that has both problems. And maybe the chances of that are smaller, right? Perhaps the code vulnerability is in one function and the S3 access is in another function. So by shrinking that attack surface, you're definitely getting to the situation where the odds of your mistakes turning into attacks are much slimmer. Of course, that's not to say that you shouldn't be working with your developers within our tool or not to help remedy the library that you're using that's got a vulnerability, move that to a newer version, or use something instead of it so that you're not exposed to that kind of attack. But it's just to point out that if we exercise least privilege on all of our resources, then we put ourselves in a situation where we are much less susceptible to these kinds of attacks. Okay, so I'm seeing in the poll, by the way, and maybe I poisoned it by telling you how surprising the results were. I'm seeing nobody fell for the 5% bait, by the way. Good for you. A couple people went for the 20%, and then we sort of evenly distributed between the 65 and 90%. So I'll tell you that we've scanned several tens of thousands of functions at this point with different customers and design partners, and we're seeing over 90%, closer to 95% in most cases, of functions that have additional permissions above what they need. Now, of course, many of those functions, even the majority of those functions, have minor additional permissions. They have access to things that they don't need but aren't necessarily terrible things. We estimate that between 15 and 25% have really critical additional permissions. So permissions to data that they don't need access to that's really sensitive, permissions to manage cloud resources, spin up EC2 machines or create Lambda functions or things like that could really let an attacker do something very risky. So we're, when we started the project, I was kind of concerned when we connected to customer accounts, maybe we wouldn't find as many things as we're purporting to find. That has not been the issue. It's quite the opposite. Maybe we're even suffering from some fatigue. We find too many of these problems. But we're seeing that the vast majority of functions have these additional permissions. And that then explains why, if there's any other security risk associated with those functions, if they have a code injection or a SQL injection or a process injection or similar type of attack that's possible on them, we've just exacerbated that by giving them access to resources they don't need and put us at risk. So how do you mitigate this problem? How do you deal with it? What we're seeing is that you can do it by hand, and we've walked through a little bit of how to do that. And the process of doing it by hand, which is okay, is to essentially do a permission review, kind of like a code review, but with the aim of looking at what are the permissions the function has and what are the permissions it needs, and try to track those down. And you can do that just by reading through the code, or you can do that by looking at what the function actually does, running it, and trying to pare down the permissions until it fails, and then sort of iteratively adjusting those permissions until you find what you feel is close to least privilege. The challenge with just reading the code is very often a lot of the functionality is wrapped up in libraries or third-party modules that you're using that are harder for you to read through, so it's not necessarily as easy to figure out, I call this function, does that function just need get bucket or also list bucket? But you can do it, and it's definitely worth doing, particularly if you have a small number of functions and you can do it by hand. There's really value doing it, and if you do it once a month, there's value. If you do it once a week, there's more value. But of course, and I don't just say this because this is one of the things that we're working on, but I say this because I really believe it's important. In the scale and the speed of serverless, you really need to automate this process. You really need to put yourself in a situation where, as soon as you know there's a problem with, there's a gap between what you need and what you have, you need to close that gap. So one part of our product, and we'll talk in other webinars about other parts of it, defense and security observability and other things. One part of our product, which we call Protego Proact, is all about delivering remediation for configuration problems. So essentially saying, let me analyze based on looking at the code, the bytecode, the deployment during CI/CD or even during runtime. Let me analyze what's going on continuously. Let me keep looking at that and seeing, hey, does that posture match the ideal posture? And if the current posture, if the amount of time a function can run for, if the permissions it has, if the triggers are allowed to call it, if the libraries it accesses, if the third-party APIs it uses, if those things are risky or not ideal, let's calculate the difference. What fixes those problems, and let's build that remediation for you. So really, we're focused on detecting the gap between the ideal configuration and the current configuration, but also baking that into how do you fix it, right? So in the case of permissions, for example, it kind of looks something like this. So you get that role to permissive issue, but we're actually saying to you, hey, we've done static analysis and dynamic analysis on the function. We've watched it run. We've watched the code. We've learned what it needs. Here's the policy statement you need. You can copy paste that. You could even ask us to change it for you if you want to give us the authority, the ability to do that, and fix it, and really try to drive remediation really quickly. And so, of course, the goal is always find the problem quickly, remediate the problem quickly. And it's not any different in serverless. It's just that what we mean by quickly in serverless is a different scale than what we used to mean by quickly. Okay, so before we get to questions, and I see a few more, but I'm still appealing to you to throw me some hard ones, because the ones I see so far are kind of easy, and I feel like I know the answers to them. Now's the time to think about, if you've got any harder questions, if you want to challenge me on something, throw it into the questions from the audience section, and let's see if we can bang our heads on those. But before that, just a quick summary of what I said. Least privilege in security has always been your friend, and it's one of the key goals for security. In serverless, it's really a much more critical piece of your security planning. So if you're thinking about sort of how to spend your time and your money, consider that in serverless, you're moving away from network security and data security and focusing much more on application security. And within application security, don't abandon or ignore the issue of security posture and least privilege. That's something you really want to focus on as one part of your solution. That's not to say that you don't need application defense, that you don't need to know what's going on, you don't need to block things that are bad. Those are all important and all part of our solution, and we'll talk about those in the future. But don't forget the fact that you can go from 0 to 70% or some number I'll make up, just by looking at what you have, figuring out what you don't need and getting rid of it, and then making sure that everything you do have is configured as well as possible. And the upside is there are tools out there that will make that process really streamlined, even in the serverless world. So that's my pitch on least privilege. Hopefully it was useful, and let's see if we can do some questions. Before the questions, I will point out some resources. On our website, you can find our blog, where I try to publish about once a week, pardon me, various things we're seeing in serverless and security and how they're playing out and what's important there. So do have a look at that and read through them. And if you disagree with me wholeheartedly, then come at me on Twitter and tell me. There's our previous webinar there, and the current webinar will be there. Our ebook on serverless security is up there as well. And there is a podcast that is focused less on just security and more on the ecosystem of serverless and what's going on, which we're going to upload every couple weeks. That focuses on sort of the latest things in serverless with various guests that we're really excited that we've started to bring on as well. So that series is coming soon. It'll go live pretty soon in a week or two. So definitely check back protego.io for those things. All right, so now let's take the remaining few minutes and try to see if we can answer a few questions. Megan, you want to field them to me?
Yeah. Yes, I will, yeah. And I wanted to jump in briefly. You mentioned early on that you could go on forever on defining serverless. And yeah, so the blogs speak to a lot of that. There's some great content there, I think, on the serverless security scorecard and different issues around that, and the shift, the changing approach you need to take with security once you go serverless. The ebook as well is accessible right from BrightTalk. So attendees, you can just go ahead and look down, and there's attachments to this webcast. You can access it directly there as well. And yeah, the podcast should be live next week sometime after just a bit of editing. I think it turned out really well, and yeah, with our first guest, so I'm looking forward to sharing that with everyone. So the first question I see here, it doesn't strike me as an easy one. You'll have to tell me if you think. What is the risk if the function is only triggered internally?
Sure, so that's a good point. And when I talked earlier about the holistic nature of security, that's one of those things where you definitely want to be taking into account what is the structure of my application. So we definitely, whether it comes to least privilege and investment of time there, and also in terms of defense, when we talk about defense and how we do defense, that's definitely going to come up as well. Where a function is, is it inside of VPC or not? Is it triggerable from the outside really easily or not? Those are important factors. Having said that, we caution people to rely too much on the notion that my function is only called by a CloudWatch trigger, for example, so I'm not worried about attackers calling it. For example, we're seeing a lot of people struggling with leaked keys. And so obviously part of the solution is, you'll see part of that, what Proact does is to try to make sure that you're not leaking keys from your code, and you can see, you're spotting those kind of things as early as possible. But developers will forever cut and paste code that they're not sure about and, stick it into Pastebin or Slack, Stack Exchange or somewhere asking for questions. And there's always, a whole bunch of really fun to use Amazon credentials and Azure credentials as well out there that you can, go find and play with. So you definitely want to be concerned not just with, is the function callable in the usual path, but what if somebody stole some keys or stole access to a different function and then can call it? Or another example there is really, that we've seen quite a bit in people trying to research how to attack serverless infrastructure is, what if I find a different function that is easier to attack, and then that function I can inject some code that does invoke lambda on the function that you're protecting. So you definitely want to consider how sure am I that this function can't be called in the outside world. Having said that, you definitely also want to triage. So if you're going to do this manually, for example, absolutely look at your functions that are connected to API Gateway and SNS and S3 first before you look at your functions that are inside of VPC or triggered by a CloudWatch event. Anything else, Megan? Do you have another one?
Yeah, thanks for that. Next one I see here is, what is the best approach in instructing developers to use least privilege without a security review for each function?
Yeah, so obviously, as we said earlier, it's challenging. I have this, this pitch where it's challenging by mindset, right? It's difficult for developers to be thinking security. I don't want that to make you think that I don't believe in training and developer responsibility. So I'm not advocating what some people advocate, which is let's just take this whole thing out of the hands of developers and either someone else owns it or create some automatic tool that owns the entire process. I think automatic tools like our own play a big role in trying to make this thing simpler, but at the end of the day, for example, training your developers to think better about security, to think more carefully about what roles they have, to do reviews of just the roles and make sure to look at like the obvious low-hanging fruit. If you have an asterisk, a wildcard in any of your permissions, that's a no-no almost always. There's almost never a time when you need that, right? And so even if your developers are not going to do code reviews all the time and check exactly whether the permissions match the code, they certainly can look at the roles and policies that they're deploying and make sure that those policies at least make a high level of sense, don't have any obvious gaping holes in them. And the other thing is that there is definitely a value in trying to do this as you develop. So as you write the code, if you're willing to spend the time to craft those roles and as you're writing your code, it's definitely easier at that point to say, okay, I just did get object, I need get object. And again, it's not foolproof, and you use libraries, and these things are a little more opaque, but there definitely is value in trying to do that. Having said that, again, I'm going to come back and say all the training and all the process in the world, I don't think is going to really close the gap as much as running a few tools to help you out is. So do both, but definitely don't abandon your tools and your processes.
Great, thanks. Now this next one, I think you may have addressed partially in your discussion of training, but how do I know exactly what I need? I've seen hundreds of options on IAM.
Trying to understand what the person who asked meant by hundreds of options. So let's assume that sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I would assume, with so many different choices, how do you narrow that down in order to make the selection of what you do need to, how you do need to configure? But of course, go ahead and type back to me if we're headed in the wrong direction here answering this question.
Yeah, no, I think I would take the question that way also. So if you ask the question and you want to type it in again at in more detail in the question section, feel free to. But I'm going to say, when you provision permissions, sure, you've got literally thousands of options, and you've got 50 or whatever services in AWS and similar numbers in the other cloud providers. And for each of those services, you've got dozens and dozens of actions that you can choose. And then for each of those actions, there's typically resources you can assign as well. So you've got a lot of choices to make. Definitely, mostly try to focus on permissioning from the bottom up. So just a kind of deny-all policy, which is the classic security approach and the opposite of what developers like to do. Start from saying, I assume that function needs nothing, and then let me just add in the permissions that I absolutely see that I need. One way to do that is to limit the permissions, run the code, see where it fails, and then try to understand from the errors. In some platforms, the error is going to be very, very verbose and easy for you to understand which permission that you're missing, and then you can just go add that permission. It's a little bit iterative. You might have to do that, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 times the first time you write your function, and then every so often you'll have to do it again. But if you're pretty careful about that, you'll probably achieve something close to least privilege. The instinct is to say, oh, I see I'm using S3 wildcard. I see I'm using DynamoDB wildcard. I'm using CosmoDB wildcard, that kind of thing. So avoiding that instinct is probably the key to provisioning it. And the other thing is there's definitely a value in looking at some of the riskier things and saying, hey, those things are things I really want to call out. So even if I'm not going to pull everything out and block everything exactly to least privilege, maybe there are a bunch of services like managing IAM roles, spinning up machines and containers, and editing and creating functions, things like that that are really risky. And so if anyone's using any of those permissions, let me have a process to catch that and question that. That's not to say it doesn't happen. Those things happen. They exist for a reason, and it's possible your code needs those. But at the same time, there's a good chance that they can be refactored in a way to make it safer. So flag those if you see them.
Great. I found your use of the phrase "avoiding that instinct" to be interesting because certainly, I'm not a developer, but I can see how that might be the instinct and the drive, and it's the wrong direction. And I think our next question might speak to that as well. And the question is, do I really need to create a different IAM role for each function? So again, I can see the instinct is to say, hey, let's just repurpose this, but is that really necessary?
Well, I mean, to a certain degree, if you're going to do things by hand, that might be a challenging thing to do. So it might be easier for you to create some buckets and say, these are the functions that need access to S3, and these are the functions that need access to my product database and things like that. Having said that, because of the nature of Lambda and Azure Functions, where you're building typically these kind of what I like to call nanoservices, that used to be a disparaging word, but now it's a positive word in software architecture. If you're building these kind of small microservices or nanoservices, there's a good chance that you can significantly limit those permissions and focus in on just the things that they need. And so definitely I think keeping that mindset of locking things down to just those small pieces that are necessary and crafting them just as you need them is really going to give people a lot of value.
Yeah, makes sense. Excellent. Well, those are all the questions I'm seeing coming in. So yeah, as you had mentioned, we have all those additional resources, and I find it very amusing and fascinating that you continue to invite your audience to question you on Twitter. So yeah, I would just reiterate that invitation to call you out and address that. And
yeah, I mean, it's early days here, right? Serverless is new, guys, and so I mean, I think that there's, I don't think we've figured everything out yet, and so there's definitely opinions out there. We have an opinion. I have an opinion. We have an opinion. It probably shifts, a couple times a day. I definitely encourage people to call me out and disagree with me, particularly if you can back it up with some evidence. I'd love to have my mind changed on some things. So keep doing that.
Excellent. All right. Well, thanks again to all of our attendees, and we definitely look forward to seeing you again and sharing more of our insight on serverless. Thanks, Hillel.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody.